Welcome to another episode of Breakthrough Dialogues, the podcast for pragmatists and problem solvers brought to you by the Breakthrough Institute. I am Alex Trembath, your host and deputy director at Breakthrough. For this episode, I sat down with Nassib Mugwanya. Nassib is an outreach officer at the Uganda Biosciences Information Center, a 2015 fellow at the Cornell Alliance for Science, and a 2018 Breakthrough Generation fellow. I wanted to talk to Nassib because I feel like in the Western world we have a lot of conversations about agriculture in emerging economies without including the communities we're talking about. These debates often center on the appropriate scale, size, and technological makeup of agriculture in poorer countries like Nassib's home country, Uganda. But as Nassib wrote in a recent essay for the Breakthrough Journal, many of the practices that Western ag NGOs promote look suspiciously like current subsistence practices in sub-Saharan Africa. So I wanted to talk to Nassib about what a modern, productive vision for agriculture in Uganda and elsewhere in Africa looks like to him. Nassib, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome, Alex, and thanks so much for hosting me.
Yeah, it's super good to talk to you again. I wanted to obviously talk to you about the essay that you wrote in the Breakthrough Journal, which all of our listeners should take a look at. And I wanted to start by asking you to explain to our listeners what people mean when they say agroecology or agroecological methods.
Thank you so much, Alex. And to answer your question is that there's so many definitions of what agroecology means, and to different people it means different things. But ultimately what agroecology is about is to do agriculture within the limits of nature. And what this means is that you minimize on the external inputs such as fertilizers, pesticides, and all modern innovations such as genetically modified seeds and other things that don't fall within what nature can provide. So basically, that's what the agroecological model is about, working within the limits of nature and also trying to look at the food system in its entirety, like going beyond production and include other aspects of the food systems such as the cultural and social aspects.
You started your career as an outreach officer sort of promoting agroecological methods in Uganda. Can you explain sort of what that looked like, sort of what type of work you were doing when you started out?
So previously, before my current job as an outreach officer, I used to work with the oldest university in Uganda, which is called Makerere University, and I was a master's student then. And what this meant was sometimes to work on community outreach projects with smallholder farmers in central Uganda. And our focus was always to work with farmers in a way that we address their problems within a holistic sort of system. And when I got done with my studies, I got this current job, which is about creating public understanding of agricultural research. And the organization I work for is also at the forefront of using new ag innovations like genetic engineering in improving crops and animals. So because of the controversy around genetic engineering, much of what I could hear when talking about its benefits to some of the challenges farmers are facing is that it doesn't fit within that agroecological model. So that was the starting place of me to start questioning how new innovations cannot fit within a systems thinking, which I think agroecology largely conforms to.
And was that difficult for you? Is that a difficult sort of change in your mind or change in your perspective? What was the experience like? Sort of going from your master's program into your position as an outreach officer. What is the sort of view of agroecology versus synthetic or biotechnological in Uganda and in the communities that you engage with?
Well, I would say really the transition wasn't that smooth from sort of being a part of a community that looks at addressing problems within a systems thinking. And then I'm now working with a new organization which has this technology which is tainted as not fitting within that system thinking. So to me, this was a learning point to start to dig deeper to understand not only it being about genetic engineering, but largely how or why new ag innovations cannot fit within a model like agroecology. And to my surprise, as much as I wanted actually to change my mind about, GMOs non or like new ag innovations not fitting within agroecology, the more I immersed myself in the literature, I didn't see why new ag innovations like genetically engineered crops or animals don't fit within that agroecological model. And this is when I started to have a deeper interest in exploring why this is the case. And that's how I started to dig deep into the subject.
So one of the arguments that you make in your essay is that the sort of communities that are advocating for more agroecological practices in Uganda and other sub-Saharan African countries are basically arguing for a set of practices and approaches and technologies that are already basically being used by smallholder subsistence farmers in your country and in other countries. So what do you mean when you say that that sub-Saharan African countries and many farmers there are already basically using agroecological practices?
Yes, what I mean by agroecology not offering radically different practices is that at the core of agroecology, when you look at its different meanings and interpretations, working within limits of nature is non-negotiable. And when you look at farming in sub-Saharan Africa, much of it is entirely farmers working within limits of nature, farmers doing practices like intercropping, which is largely advocated for within agroecology, farmers relying entirely on organic sort of fertilizers to improve the yields of their crops. So when I was examining the literature on agroecology, I expected to see something radically different. And I'm like, any model which seeks to transform agriculture in Africa from where it is today needs to offer something at least different. And I didn't see that in most of what I saw in the literature, but rather agroecology seemed to just push for the same traditional farming practices that have been part of the farming system of farmers since pre-colonial times. So this is where I felt like this is not a model which is actually pushing for any transformation. If you want to see anything different in terms of what farmers are benefiting uh, from agriculture, and that those benefits are as a result of taking on a new practice. I don't see agroecology as offering anything different from what they've been doing. And to me, it seemed like much as farmers maybe in Africa have not called it agroecology, but essentially what they've been doing or farming has been what agroecology is pushing for.
And Nassib, you're an outreach officer working in Uganda. You've also spent a lot of time in the United States at Cornell's Alliance for Science and at the Breakthrough Institute. So one of the reasons I really wanted to talk to you is because you've really seen sort of every angle on these problems. So I'm curious, sort of in your work with farmers and landholders in Uganda, what are they looking for? What are the types of solutions or action that they're looking for from you or from the United States or European NGOs? So sort of what do they come to you for?
That's a good question, Alex. And for all my time, for more than 6 years, every time I've interacted with farmers, they would barely have the same sort of debates we have about which way to farm, what is the best, model for them to get out of poverty. Farmers are really practical people. And for most of my interactions, like today, I can give you an example. I was addressing a group of women farmers under the Uganda Women Network, and I was telling them about the drought-tolerant maize and pest-resistant maize that our organization is developing. And one farmer asked me whether this maize variety has a good flour quality, since where she comes from, people appreciate more of the flour quality than drought tolerance and pest resistance. So the point I'm trying to make here is that farmers will always approach you with a problem, and all they are looking for is a solution. Barely have I met any farmer who would ask me, give me this sort of variety that is maybe bred using this sort of technology. A farmer will tell you about their bananas having been infected by banana bacterial wilt. And when they learn that you're coming from a research institution, they'll be like, do you know of any varieties that can address this problem of banana bacterial wilt? And then it's upon you as an outreach officer to give farmers a range of options you have, and then basing on their uh, localities or agroecological, uh, basing on their agroecological zone, you prescribe a certain sort of variety that meets their needs. So I should say farmers are very practical oriented. They are always approaching issues from a solution perspective than, being in these debates of I don't want a GMO or I want something very organic.
Right. So the concern for farmers is not so much is this approach agroecological, biotechnological, organic, synthetic. It's will this solve the problem that I have?
Correct. And I should say to emphasize this point is that no farmer I've met wants to wake up to go and spray their garden. If nature can help them hack a certain pest or insect problem, there's no farmer who wants to spend money on buying insecticides if nature can help them do that. All the farmers that I've met who have gone to buy maybe a pesticide or a herbicide, it's because working within nature has not been helping or giving them so much headway regarding a certain problem they are facing. So it's not true that farmers wake up and they want to maybe just go and buy fertilizers or buy GMO seeds. if there is a naturally available solution that is working for them, farmers will embrace it. And by the time they are not embracing a natural solution, it means it's not giving them so much headway in terms of addressing the problem they're facing.
So, from your perspective, again, having done most of your work in Uganda, also spent time in the United States, what are European and US and other foreign institutions doing in Uganda and other sub-Saharan African countries? And are they mostly helping or hurting or something else?
I should say that much of the donor funding that comes to support projects in agriculture largely come from agencies like, from the US, USAID. And then when it comes to research projects, it's between universities. And when it comes to Europe, there's like UK Aid. And all these donor fundings come with sort of like directions or interests they have. And when you look at what is happening right now in most of sub-Saharan countries, is sort of an extension of some of the interests of who is funding a certain intervention in agriculture. And because of Europeans sort of, I would say, I wouldn't want to call it resistance, but not so forthcoming about newer advances in agriculture, such as genetic engineering, you'll find that much of the funding that comes from Europe, which is meant to help with agricultural challenges or development, would steer clear of interventions that take on projects that are about using genetically modified crops or research. And then when it comes to funding that comes from the US, where there's so much research and development regarding genetic engineering, they'll be more interested in any projects that are sort of looking at, these new innovations like GMOs and how they can help with challenges that are unique to places like sub-Saharan Africa. So I should say much of the agricultural agenda and research and development in sub-Saharan Africa is partly shaped by where the funding is coming from. If the funding is coming from a donor who is very passionate about agroecology, that will end up being also the sort of project pushed. If the funding is coming from Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who is very progressive and looking at how, technology in all aspects of life can be harnessed to address some of the big challenges, they'll be very supportive of new innovations like genetic engineering and other crop improvement methods that are very progressive.
And how do the local governments, local research agencies, local organizations like yours sort of feel about the donor funding and interest coming in terms of how much is good, how much is bad, what sort of amount of control U.S., European, foreign interests have over the direction of agriculture in Uganda and other sub-Saharan African countries?
Well, I should say that the good thing with my organization is that it's a government organization, it's a public agency. And so what that means is that much as the donors come with their, interests, we are mandated to sort of prioritize national interests over donor interests. And so when it comes to doing research, ultimately, irrespective of where the donor funding is coming from, we look at the priorities of the agriculture sector in Uganda. And then if a donor comes and wants to, for example, help with a crop like cassava, which is widely eaten by many people in Uganda, and it's having a challenge like viral diseases, and that's what we are working on with already the funding we are getting from government. So that funding will sort of be taken with open arms. So I should say that when it comes to government agencies like what I'm working for or what I'm working for, there's sort of more control in terms of determining what research direction to take. But when it comes to non-governmental and non-governmental organizations, civil society organizations, they don't have so much control because their lifeline is purely based on external funding, and whatever that donor wants is what they are supposed to push. And when you look at much of the resistance towards new innovations in agriculture, like GMOs, much of this is pushed by non-governmental and non-governmental organizations that are purely funded to push a certain model which the donor feels is fit for Africa. So I would say for government agencies, there's some sort of control in terms of pushing a direction of agriculture or research. But when it comes to civil society organization, there's not so much control.
Is that unique to Uganda? Are the governments of other sub-Saharan African countries more open to sort of, like you say, a wider set of technological and practical approaches to the challenges of farming, or is Uganda a leader in that in Africa?
I would say it's typical of most sub-Saharan governments because there's some context also around how the agricultural research and development is led. Much of this is public sector driven. And so what that means is that most of the governments in sub-Saharan Africa are at the forefront of agricultural research and development, which is different in other parts of the world. Like in the US, you realize there's a lot of private sector driven research and development when it comes to agriculture. So some of the arguments actually you hear against new innovations like genetically modified organisms are because of some people who feel strongly about private sector involvement in agriculture, which is a purely maybe valid debate in places like the US or Europe. But when it comes to places like the developing world, that is not the case. Much of the agricultural research and development is led by the public sector. So if one's opposition to newer advances or innovations in agriculture is as a result of private corporate involvement or private sector involvement, that is not a valid argument here in the developing world where much of it is public sector driven.
Thanks, Nassib. And I'm curious sort of how you got involved in this work in the first place. You mentioned you did your master's in Uganda. You're working with the Institute now. You've worked at Cornell's Alliance for Science and at the Breakthrough Institute. So what got you interested in food and ag issues in the first place?
That's a good question. So I should say generally a pro-choice. And when I tell people I'm pro-choice, it's a term normally used in reproductive health in terms of, women having the right to choose what to do with their bodies. But I should say I got involved because when the conversation around genetically modified organisms was starting in Uganda, which is about, 8 years ago when I was still a a master's student, much of it was negative and sort of cynical. And I was trying to look at voices that were positive about these newer advances in agriculture and how they can help with some of the problems farmers are facing, like, the banana bacterial wilt, which is a big problem for banana farmers, cassava, mosaic and brown streak disease, which are big viral diseases for cassava. And this technology of genetic engineering was one of those that were showing promising results in addressing these problems. So I got a keen interest in trying to be one of the positive voices that can talk about the benefits of this new technology. And I also became part of this biotech or pro agriculture innovation group because I was seeing that much of the people who were dictating to farmers on how to farm were well-fed and privileged folks in society. And my time as a grad student had made me immerse myself in the hardships and livelihoods of farmers. And I was not ready to be part of any group which stands in the way of any options that can help to address some of the problems farmers are facing. So that's how I got involved to sort of be one of the advocates of choice. And by this, I mean like let farmers be given a chance to choose what sort of agricultural innovations work for them and let them be the ones to decide what is good or not bad on their farm. So that's how I got involved, like having that sort of concern that there were people who were sort of deciding for farmers, yet they were not facing the same problems farmers are facing. Maybe I should conclude by how my favorite part of the article, which I like most, is the part which, talks about whatever the problems of modern farming could be. And we know definitely anything new comes with its own challenges and limitations. That that shouldn't mean that we should dogmatically adhere to a model fundamentally based on traditional farming practices. And so I'm a very, very strong advocate for giving farmers a full range of options, whether this means from traditional or to modern, but no one should stand in that way of having farmers having multiple options to choose from in terms of addressing their different problems on the farm.
Well, I'm certainly glad you got involved. Honestly, I'm very grateful to have discovered your voice in these issues, Nassib. Nassib, I want to thank you for joining us today.
Thank you too, Alex.
Thanks for tuning in to Breakthrough Dialogues. If you like our show, tell your friends, rate us and subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or whatever platform you get your podcasts. I want to again thank my guest Nassib and our producers Alyssa Kadaman and Tolly Perlman. Catch you next time.